Welcome to this writing course where we will be looking at how to write a scholarly essay. This is what we always ask you to write here at MF, a scholarly essay. So if you get an exam question or an assignment where it says present and discuss or discuss this and that, etc., it's a scholarly essay that we want you to write. And I'm not going to talk about now the process of writing, but what it should look like in the end when you're done. Because such an essay should always have 3 or 4 components. What I say now is quite general and will apply to most disciplines, but some disciplines will have extra ideals and etc., especially the biblical studies. So you need to talk to your teachers there as well. But in many of the topics that you will be studying here at MF and other places, it will be the same. You can see that if you look in book and articles and etc., you'll see that it's the general same structure that you find very many places. So, such a scholarly essay then should have 3 or 4 parts. The first is an introduction, where you say what you're going to write about, how you're going to do it. Then there's a presentation, where we present the topic of your essay. And then there's a discussion. But I put that in parentheses because it's not always that you're asked to discuss something. Maybe you're just asked to present. But if you're asked to discuss, then that's an important part. And then in the end, there's a conclusion. So what I will do now is I'll talk about each of these, and I'll start now with number 1, the introduction. An introduction usually contains 2 or 3 parts. The first part is, what you do there is you define the problem. Because you're given a task, or you have selected it yourself, but such a research problem or the task you've been given, it can always be understood in many different ways. So that's why it's important to say a bit more about how you understand it. Because even if you think that, well, there's one clear way of understanding this, the reader may think of something else. When I correct papers from students, even if they have the same task, they have always written very different things. So it's useful to hear a bit about how you understand the problem in the beginning. And I often advise my students that you should try to formulate a question at the beginning, and then you can discuss back and forth, and then end with an answer in the end. That's a very easy and clear way to read a paper. You don't have to do it like that, but I often try to do that myself. An important part of defining the problem is limitation. Because there's so much to write about any question, and usually you have word limits. You have to write no more than 4,000 words, for example. And then you need to say a bit also about what have you chosen to write about and what have you chosen to leave out. This is a good thing. To have a narrow paper is a good thing. It maybe you think that, oh, I should write a little bit about everything, but then it will be superficial. It will be easy, something that everyone could have written. It's better to select a narrow area and then focus on that and dig really deep into that and discuss back and forth on something narrow. Then the reader will think, oh, very good, you were able to dig very deep on that specific topic, and you could have selected anything else and also worked very thoroughly with that. That's what we want you to be able to do. So it's just a good thing to be narrow. And you can then add some reasons as to why you chose this specific topic. You can always use the reason that I want to avoid being superficial. I want to focus on one particular area to be able to discuss that properly and adequately and thoroughly and etc. So within the broad topic that you've been given, select something. It shouldn't be very strange. It should be in the central area of what you have been asked to do. But as long as you stay within the limits of of the assignment, it's just a good thing to select a narrow area. And of course, then if you're sitting at an exam, of course you should pick the area that you know most about. And then you can say, now I want to write about this and not about that. And if you have then written this explicit limitation, given reasons for it, then the person who is going to give a grade can't say, oh, that's wrong, you should have done something else, because you're free to choose this or that focus. So that's a quite smart advice. And it's good to show that you're able to dig deep into a narrow question. That's what we're interested in. So I have an example here on the PowerPoint. Let's say you've been given the task at the exam, compare the concept of God in Christianity and Islam. Okay, what does it mean, for example, to compare something? Does it mean just to describe the similarities and the differences in these two concepts of God? Or does it also mean that you should evaluate them? Talk about what's good or plausible or reasonable, etc. And what is a concept of God? What does that mean? And a Christian concept of God and a Muslim concept of God, will you consider then all parts of this concept, all the different attributes of God? Or are you going to select some specific parts and just talk about those? And will you consider all forms of Christianity and Islam? Or will you choose some specific denominations within that? Or just say, this is general to all Christians and this is general to all Muslims? These are different questions that the reader will wonder about when they see, okay, here's a student who wants to compare these two concepts. How are they going to solve this? And it's good that you write about it in the beginning of your paper. So that was point number A. And then we have B, define central terms. Central or important terms. Because in the assignment or maybe in your paper or essay, there may be some important terms that you use many times, but they can mean different things. Those are the ones that it's important to define. So it's not always that you have to include this point, but if there are some important terms that can be understood in different ways, then it's important that you write what you mean when you use that word. And it's a bit difficult because maybe you think, well, this word only has one straight meaning, and you don't know that actually other people think about other kinds of meanings. I sometimes use an example. I say justice. Maybe you think, okay, I know what justice is, but maybe other people, they say, well, we have the word was there for me. Yes, we have distributive justice, which is about how you share different goods, and we have retributive justice, which is about what's a just punishment. And we have different forms of distributive justice. What is just? Is it to give everybody, is it that it should be equal for all, or is it that it should be according to need, or should it be according to effort? And then you have subtypes of this again. Should I have an equal portion, or should I have an equal result, etc. So maybe when you use the word justice, you think, well, it just means one thing, but maybe the reader will think about many different kinds of justice, and they think, well, what do you mean? And even if you didn't know about this, if you said, well, by justice, I mean that everybody should have an equal portion. Okay, then the reader knows this is the kind of justice you're talking about. And then it's possible to evaluate your arguments, etc. But if we don't know what you mean with the concept, then it's much more difficult to assess your discussion, etc. Because let's say you're discussing duty ethics, and there are two forms of duty ethics, autonomous and heteronomous. Then, if you haven't specified which kind you mean, then the arguments will be, or the reader will think, well, you're right if you mean that form of duty ethics, but you're wrong if you mean that form of duty ethics. Or let's say you're talking about Christians. Then it's important, how do you define a Christian? One can make it 1 billion Christians or 2 billion Christians according to how one defines the term. So it's important to be precise and define such terms. But of course, one doesn't know what one doesn't know. How do you know then if people have another understanding of a term than you do? Well, what you need to do is you have to read the curriculum and see what does it say there. Because in the curriculum, they also often discuss important terms. So if you read about the Revelation, for instance, they will typically say, we often distinguish in Christian theology between two kinds of revelation, special and general revelation, for instance. And then you learn about this. And it's good to also go to the curriculum to find definitions. If you just go to a dictionary, you may be in trouble because how words are used in daily life is often quite different from how they're used in one academic discipline. So I often see that that's a problem. People just go to Wikipedia or some encyclopedia or a dictionary, and they give a very strange and not appropriate definition. So for instance, one student who was going to write about the term thesis in the philosopher Hegel. Thesis is an important term. It's a kind of specific way that the society can relate to a problem, and then there may be an antithesis. People think differently, and then they discuss and they agree on a synthesis. But anyway, the student had just looked in a dictionary and seen that in Norwegian, a thesis can mean an old shoe. So just said, well, this means an old shoe. And of course, that's very strange to talk about the philosopher Hegel and what he thinks about old shoes. So it's important to find out how it's used in your discipline. Let's see, I have an example here on the blackboard on definition of central terms. For instance, then, with the previous assignment, if it was to compare concepts of God in Islam and Christianity, one could say, well, concept of God, that's a human understanding of God as opposed to God's self. And one could say, by Islam, I'm going to refer to Sunni Islam. Because that's also something you can do. You can say what you mean, but instead of saying autonomous duty ethics or something long term and repeat that again and again, you can just say, by duty ethics, I mean autonomous duty ethics. So that was that point. Then I go to to C, which is outline. Here you present the structure of your essay. Say what comes first, what comes then, why have I done it like this? This is also very helpful for the reader because it's much easier to read when you know what comes when. And this is also something we're interested in because we're not so interested in what is the answer that you end up with in the end. We're more interested in seeing that when you face some sort of problem, then you're able to define the problem, understand it precisely and clear, and then make a strategy for how you're going to find an answer. Because that's an important point for understanding all of this. It's not the case that we think that there are specific answers to questions that we want you to know, because the people who work here, they disagree also on how one should understand revelation or concepts of God or baptism or whatever. But we want you to be able to take part in the discussion in a qualified way. And that later in life, when you face new questions that you haven't read about here while you were students, you're able again to work with those questions and find good answers. So that was about the introduction then. It's good to use a page on the introduction. If you just start writing, then the reader has no idea what's coming now, and it's quite difficult to read. So this is very helpful to show that you've been thinking about this, you have a plan, you know a lot, and you have a strategy for how to solve your problem. So that was part one on the introduction. Then we go to part two, which is the presentation. sometimes called an exposition. There are a bit different ideals pertaining to the presentation, whether you're going to write just a presentation or a presentation first and then a discussion afterwards. So let's say you're just writing a presentation. Just presentation. That's here, presentation. And here it's presentation plus discussion. Okay. So if you're just writing a presentation, the reader or the one going to give a grade will ask for, is this a clear presentation? Do we understand what you mean? Is it fluent language? Do you repeat yourself a lot, skip and jump, or is it a logical development? And they will see, is this precise? Do we understand what you mean, or is it very ambiguous? Do you define important terms, etc.? And have you been able to select the important parts of this topic? Typically, sometimes, for instance, in the philosophy course, we ask people to write about the epistemology of Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, and those who don't know much about it, they write a lot about the life of Immanuel Kant was born then and there, and this happened, and that's not important. That's not what we want to hear about. So are you able to pick out the important parts? Then we understand that you have understood this. So when it comes to references and sources, etc., I'm going to talk about that in another lecture. So I leave that out here. But is it clear, precise, and have you been able to select the important parts? If you're writing a presentation and then a discussion, then again, of course, it's important to be clear, precise, and to select the important parts. But in addition then, the presentation should be relevant for the discussion. Because then the function of the presentation is to be an introduction to the discussion. You should then write about what you need, what is useful to know when the discussion comes afterwards. So for instance, if your assignment is to discuss Christian views on baptism, and you say, well, there's plenty of views on baptism in Christianity, I can't discuss them all, so I've selected now a Pentecostal view and a Catholic view. And I'm going to discuss Catholic versus Protestant, no, Catholic versus Pentecostal. Then it's irrelevant to use a lot of time in the presentation to write about the Lutheran view of baptism, because you're not going to discuss that. Even if you write very smart and good things about it, the reader would think, this is irrelevant, you should have used these pages on presenting more about the Pentecostal and Catholic instead. So this is irrelevant, and it will count negative on your grade. So this is important that when you have written a discussion, you should look again at your presentation, because often you have a plan, you write a presentation, you start writing a discussion, and then you see that things doesn't go quite the way you planned. You found out, oh, this was more interesting to discuss instead. Then take a look at the presentation again and see, is there something I should write more about here? Is it something I should cut out? Yes, that was point number 2, the presentation. I don't have an example on that because that would be too long. But now I'll write about, or talk about, number 3, which is the discussion. What is a discussion? Well, a discussion is a text where you present arguments for and against something. It could be just one question, for and against, or yes and no, but it could also be discussing or evaluating different theories, different alternatives, etc. It doesn't have to be just 2, but anyway, it has to be arguments for and against something. And what is an argument? Well, if you make a claim about either the way something is or the way something should be, then an argument is a new claim which makes the previous claim, which either supports it or counts against it. So for instance, if I claim tomorrow it will be sunny, Then if I come with a new claim, which is because that's what they said on the weather forecast at NRK today, then that's an argument in favor of supporting that it will be sun tomorrow. But if you say, well, at TV2, the weather forecast said it would be rain, then that would be an argument or a claim that makes the previous claim less plausible, less likely to be true, then it's a counter-argument. So that's what an argument is. And in a discussion, you should have arguments for and against. Arguments for and against something. I don't mean that you have to present equally many for and against. That's not the point. You may be very strongly in favor of something or against something, but you need to be able to show that you know that there are arguments for and against, and then you can criticize, for instance, the arguments that you think are bad. There are two levels then in a discussion. First of all, you need to present some arguments. You need to find some arguments at all. But the very best is if you're able also to evaluate the arguments. Say that this argument is good or this argument is bad because so and so. And how do you do that? How do you show that an argument is good, or how do you support an argument or counter it? Well, just by making, again, new claims, supporting then this claim or contradicting it. So for instance, if I if I say a claim it's sunny tomorrow, it will be sun tomorrow, and the argument is because NRK said so, if I want to support that argument, I could come with new claims and say, and they have their information from Meteorological Institute, and there are professional people working there who have a lot of satellites and stuff. They really know, they are good at giving accurate predictions on the weather, etc. Whereas if you said, well, yeah, but TV2 said something else, well, they don't know much. That Storm Weather Center, it's a lot worse than the Meteorological Institute that supports NRK. So that's how you discuss arguments then. Come with new arguments in favor or against the argument. And again, if you're writing a discussion, then this is the most important part of your whole essay. This is where it will be, when the teacher is going to give a grade, they will look mainly at the discussion. That's the most important part, because the presentation, most students are able to read a book and give a fair presentation. This is a difficult part, where you contribute yourself and start weighing, where it's not a correct answer. One needs to look at different arguments to see how do they weigh compared to each other. So this is where you can contribute, and this is what we want you to learn. We don't want you to learn just this is the right view on baptism and this is the right view and so, because we don't know what the right views are. People who work here, they disagree. But we want you to be able to enter into discussion, that you can be part of the ongoing discussion. What should we think about revelation or this concept of God or duty ethics and etc., etc. So this is what we want you to know. And what is very common is that students write long presentations and then hardly any discussion at the end, maybe just a short discussion. So I try to encourage my students to think, well, you should write a discussion which is twice as long as the presentation, because that's the most interesting part. That's what I don't expect that to be. It's difficult, but just so you know where you do the most important work, that's in the discussion. I have done an example of a discussion here at my PowerPoint. Let's see. Oh, I forgot this example on the outline, which was point C in the introduction. Sorry, but we'll do it now. I will now compare the concepts of God in Lutheran Christianity and Sunni Islam. I will do a thematical comparison and focus on the omnipotence, holiness, and goodness of God. So here we see then that the person has chosen some directions within Christianity and Islam and chosen some, focused on some aspects of the concept of God, and then explains, this is how I will do it. But here, the discussion. Let's say that you are going to discuss duty ethics, and you have found two arguments in favor of duty ethics, namely that it's concrete and simple. Then it would be possible to just present those arguments, like in the sentence on top, Duty ethics is good because it's concrete and simple. It's also good that, and so some new arguments. But the problem here is that in this sentence, you just mention the arguments briefly without evaluating them. So instead, one can try to unravel it a bit, say a bit more about, well, what about these arguments? Are they good or are they bad? Are they important arguments in favor of them or against them? So instead, one could try to write one paragraph about the argument that it's concrete and one paragraph about the argument that it's simple, like I've done here. And then it says, okay, it's an advantage with duty ethics that it's concrete. Okay, why is that an advantage? Well, because then it's easy to relate to, it's easy to understand, compared to more abstract principles like you find in other ethical theories. On the other hand, it will then often be the case that the rules do not apply to more complex situations. Rather, they become rigid and authoritarian instead of people using their own judgments or are helped by some more general principles to find good solutions. So many forms of duty ethics become too concrete, too inflexible. Then you've said something about the argument, given some arguments for and against the argument, and then you move on. Another advantage with duty ethics is that it's simple. It does works well for children or a large group of people, for instance, in a factory or in a big workplace or something. But again, it's a disadvantage that duty ethics becomes too simple. While life is so complex, that simple rules will not always apply to a specific situation. Maybe just say, don't lie, but maybe there's a specific situation where it's very important to lie, for instance. So this is a great disadvantage, since ethics should be applicable to realistic situations in order to be experienced as relevant. So very often, students write so briefly that people don't, or the reader don't know exactly what do you mean. Because it's easy for you, you know what you're thinking, but it's maybe not so easy for another person reading and thinking somewhat differently. So try to unravel a bit, make one paragraph, for instance, per argument or per main point in discussion, because that will increase the chance that it becomes clear and thorough. And it helps you stretch the discussion, which is the most important part. Okay, that was discussion. Then we have the final point, which is the conclusion. And again, the conclusion is a bit different if you have written a discussion or just a presentation. So let me see here. If you've just written a presentation, then the conclusion will be a summary of main parts. So for instance, I've now presented the philosophy of the philosopher Plato, and we've seen that he has two main there are two main parts of this, namely this and that. So just a brief summary then of what you've done. But if you have written a discussion, then the conclusion is your opinion, or your answer to the question, or about the topic, your opinion. And that's important, because if you have been discussing a question for and against, we want you to end up with an answer. We want to hear, well, now that you've been weighing all these arguments, how do you conclude in the end? And many students skip this point. I think they think it's too difficult, or they just say, well, this is a difficult question, or this is something we could have discussed for a long time, or something like that. But then all the arguments for and against hasn't led you somewhere. So this is where you end up in goal, and so you should include a conclusion. Even if you're uncertain, then you can have an uncertain conclusion. You can say, I've seen that there are good arguments for and against this, for this and this, and against, if I have to choose, I think I would tend to go in this direction or something. You can have a more careful conclusion. But it's good to have a conclusion. And so when you write the conclusions, you could it's good to start with main points from the discussion. That's a good way to start. When you write your conclusion, you start by saying, in this discussion we've seen that this and this is in favor of that, but this and this is against, or In this discussion, we looked at 3 alternative theories, and we've seen that the main problem with the first 2 was this, and yeah. So that's a good way to start. And then you should have no new arguments or new theories or new important facts, because now you're just tying the knot, you're just drawing the lines together. You're not suddenly coming with new arguments. If you think of a new argument when you're writing the conclusion, then just move it up to the discussion. It should then be correspondence between the discussion and the conclusion. And that means that if you have been arguing very strongly in favor of one view of baptism or one certain opinion, then you should also conclude by being in favor of that specific alternative, because it looks very strange if you say, if you come with a lot of arguments in favor of Pentecostal view on baptism and then conclude, I think the Lutheran is the best. And I mention this because I think some students, they think that I have to write what I think the teacher thinks, or what they think at MF or something like that. But that's not the case. We don't give you the grade based on your conclusion, but based on the discussion. That's what we want to see. And I have plenty of examples here of my colleagues and myself. We have given top grades even if we totally disagree with the conclusion, because it's not the case, as I've said now sometimes, that we want you to learn the correct answers or what we think because we disagree on this. We want you to be able to face new problems later in life, that you have the ability to meet a lot of new questions and then have a discussion, be precise, clear, thorough, everything, and then end up with what you think is the best answer. So that should be correspondence, and in the end, there should be, that goes for the whole essay, but also in the conclusion, no preaching. Because many new students at MF do that as well. They write nice things about God, or a prayer, or a psalm, or a hymn, or something like that. God bless the person who's going to read this, etc. But that's out of genre. That's fine when you're in chapel, etc. But it's not something that belongs in a scholarly essay. So it will be counted against you instead of in your favor. So, I have an example of a conclusion. In this essay, I have discussed duty ethics as an ethical theory. There are good arguments in its favor, for example, that it's concrete and easy to understand. But we've also seen that there are important counter-arguments, for example, that it becomes too abstract and without nuances. I find good arguments both for and against duty ethics, but I think that there are better arguments against than for. My most important argument is that life is too complex for duty ethics to work as a sufficient ethical theory. So then, in this lecture, I've talked about the 4 main parts of a scholarly essay, and if you read articles and books, etc., I think you will see that most scholars, they do it like this. They write an introduction where they explain what they will do, they define important terms, they give an outline, and then comes presentation and discussion with the conclusion in the end. In other lectures, I'll write about the process before you start writing, and I'll talk about references and footnotes and all that. But this was what I had to say about what a scholarly essay should look like.